If you're thinking about getting into this space, if you're looking at opportunities, invest in companies that are solving problems through government contracts rather than invest in a government contractor.
So one of the areas that we're particularly excited about for national security is our investments in quantum computing. Even though the word AI, machine learning, has been used for so long within the cyber world, I do think in the future that you might be able to see some more automation, true automation within cybersecurity.
The benefit of us being NASA's partner is that based on how we're setting up Haven 2 with multiple modules, is that we now have the ability to partner with multiple countries.
What you really want to see is flexible contract vehicles that source real innovation and not the same services from a company that's just small.
My name is Ben King. I'll be the moderator and leader of the session today. I am the founder and managing partner of Glended Advisors. We're venture investors, strategic advisors, and also function as operating partners as well. I've done multiple tours leading venture-backed companies, scaling and selling them, including in the national security space. I have a wonderful panel for you today. First up, we have the CFO of VAS. VAS is getting a lot of love today. So we have Sid Hariharan with us. We also have Fen Zhao. Fen currently is the director of data science at Alpha Edison, an early stage VC firm here in LA that is focused on deep tech. Fen in particular is focused on the investments in data science, AI, deep tech. Previously, she also spent time in government as program officer for the National Science Foundation and in the Obama Administration Office of Science and Tech Policy in the National Security Division. And she is also a deep technologist. She has a PhD from Stanford in applied physics, and that's the lightest weight degree that she has. And finally, we have with us here David Brinkley, managing director at Navigant, where he heads the firm's investment banking and advisory services across the government and security sectors. David brings over 25 years of experience and has executed in excess of $5 billion in strategic transactions for middle market enterprises all across the waterfront of national security, including aerospace, defense, government contractors. He's widely recognized for his industry expertise on advanced technologies applied to problem sets in the intelligence community and broader national security space. So with that said, let's go ahead and we'll get started here. First of all, of course, we're at a really interesting time here in LA in particular, and everyone that's on stage in this panel reflects that. As many of you probably know, national security has been a bedrock industry in Los Angeles for the better part of at least 8 decades, beginning with more of the military and then, of course, the aerospace industries. And what's really exciting about an LA ecosystem in particular is that it's continued to evolve and blossom into next gen and next gen and next gen in terms of national security technology innovation. Along with the DC metro area, Northern Virginia corridor, LA is right there in terms of one of the top 2 leaders in this area. And I think we're just getting started with the next leg here. So I want to go ahead and I want to start off for the panel here to keep it broad first. For each of you, what do you see as the most notable segments of cutting-edge national security-oriented tech innovation and investment today? We'll go ahead. We'll start with you, Fen.
Hi, so I'm Fen. So one of the areas that we're particularly excited about for national security is our investments in quantum computing. And people are talking about AI a lot right now. And AI is very sort of the big industry of the moment. But if you think about what the next phase of it is, it really is around the areas of quantum computing and quantum-enabled technology. So I mean that to be not just the stereotypical quantum computer, but quantum communication systems or quantum sensors. So I think one of these areas, I think for me, as a physicist, we've seen a lot of technologies that have taken 20 years to come to the forefront, and we're right now at the cusp of seeing these actually commercialized. Things that were developed in the 90s. Quantum computing, the theory of it, some of the most exciting discoveries were in the 90s, and it's taken 20 years to get here, right? 20 years of both, classed and unclassed research to get to this point. And so I think what you're gonna see is sort of the next generation of sensors, the next generation of hardware enabled by a lot of physics, new physics that are going to sort of hit the market within the next, I would say, 5 years.
Spoken like a true technologist. David?
When we look at the defense market, I've got some numbers I can share with you guys. I spent 2 years working at OSD with an old-time mentor of mine. He used to say, the Department of Defense is not my favorite, it's not your favorite uncle, but certainly your richest. So in fiscal year 24, the defense budget was $880 billion, $170 billion in procurement, $150 in R&D. When you talk about technology, there's about $60 billion of contractor addressable IT spending within the Defense Department. At Navigant, we are focused on working with high-performing private companies in the middle market. And where we see the most opportunity are in businesses that are in sectors where disruption is possible and where we have a government customer that is aggressive about stretching the rules of engagement to bring in real innovation into this space, because the acquisition machinery is sclerotic and it's slow moving. And so some of those areas where we see really exciting innovation happening in the middle market are certainly software development, agile development, and the development of software as a service business models that can be delivered to the customer rapidly. Unmanned systems, about $10 billion in investment in fiscal year 24. It's probably another $5 billion in the classified budget in terms of robotics and unmanned systems. Support to the intelligence community has been a very active area. Data analytics and cloud computing and migration is another area where we see very interesting overlap between the private sector and the public sector. So there's some of the areas that we're focused on.
Thank you for that. And of course, over to you, Sid. Obviously, I'm going to just be psychic here. You're going to say space?
No brownie points for that.
Love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, as the CFO of VAST, obviously space is critical for us. I think what's driving national security implications for the US in particular is a seismic event happening in 2030 with NASA effectively decommissioning the ISS, which has been a symbol of US leadership in space for many decades right now. It's a way for us to demonstrate leadership, for us to develop really cutting edge technology that has applications both civilian and more importantly for the military back on Earth. It's also a symbol of soft power and soft diplomacy. And so for us, we obviously feel that being able to replace the ISS with a better solution is critical for national security implications.
That's really interesting observation. I'd love to hear a brief follow-up on that point. I hear you saying that in some ways, from a national perspective, we're conceding to some degree, at least from more of a government perspective, we're conceding space. And obviously there's lots of companies that are stepping into that gap, both with commercial and obviously national security and government applications. But again, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your perspective. I mean, are you saying sort of, again, really we're apart from sort of private funding, have we, as a government, conceded space?
Absolutely not. And I think the beauty of NASA is that there was a lot of foresight into the decision that they've made in terms of decommissioning it. And for those of you who heard Max's presentation earlier, there is a program called CLD, which they will be sending out an RFP for next year, and the intent is to award one, maybe even two private space stations. The intent is for NASA to still display leadership, but to do it in partnership with a private company that has those capabilities. The benefit of us being NASA's partner is that based on how we're setting up Haven 2 with multiple modules, is that we now have the ability to partner with multiple countries, and we're already getting a lot of inbound interest from other allied nations of the US looking for a solution where they can have a more active role. So conversely, I think it actually gives the US, through NASA and through us, an even bigger footprint to lead in space.
Appreciate that texture. I'd like to shift focus for a minute to an area that, of course, is inherently central to national security. I'd like to talk about cybersecurity here. And of course, you know, for a little bit of context, I mean, imagine a world where, for example, the Chinese, you know, essentially hack Office of Personnel and Management, OPM, which is one of the most sensitive U.S. government databases and systems. It shows everyone that holds any kind of a clearance or has applied for one, including the most sensitive clearances. Also imagine that the Chinese had hacked essentially the crown jewels of energy, and meaning more specifically, the U.S. government and kind of the major energy companies in the U.S. Hacked and had access to and essentially gained all the future planning for those major energy companies and their bidding prospects, and lifted that information and then took it and advanced their own energy posture by at least 50 years, maybe more, which you see today, China is the dominant power in Africa for resources and energy. Just imagine a world where something like those kinds of things happen. That was 2014. That's 10 years ago. So imagine, in terms of the escalation and the continuous escalation and criticality of cybersecurity, there's hardly anything else from a national security perspective, arguably, that's more important than cyber. So the stakes continue to go up. And so I'd like to shift back to the panel in terms of cyber threats and also innovation and defense across cybersecurity. Of course, there's multiple applications, whether it's critical infrastructure or IoT or data exfiltration. So I'd like to go back to Fen first, as well as David, to talk a little bit more about what they see as at the very cutting edge of national security via cybersecurity technology innovation. Fen, you first.
Sure. So one of the ways that I think about defense is that there's, and tech innovations, there's two things. One is the US has this incredible capacity for doing amazing new technologies that enable better security for our, so new space technologies, right? We've been dominant in space for years. There's a competition around space now internationally that didn't exist for a very long time. It exists now. So you have this line of what does our adversary do? They can try to build the same sort of lanes of technology as us. The other bigger issue is more like the countermeasures to defeat the things that we've built, right? And so that's where you think about cybersecurity, right? So one of the areas of great concern right now in the conflict zones is GPS denial. So we've built this incredible infrastructure around GPS, and now the enemy, instead of having to build their own GPS, right, or put in the huge amount of capital to do something like that, they can build systems to just disable our own advantages in the war front or at home, right? And so how do we then build the technologies to counter those countermeasures? I'll give you an example. We can use our own incredible capacities in science to do that. one area, one of the companies I've invested in is a company called Q-Control, and they're making sensors, new kinds of ultra-sensitive quantum sensors to be able to navigate in areas of GPS denial, right? And something that other nations can't do because the level of scientific innovation required doesn't exist in that many other countries, right? And we can try to defeat those countermeasures, and it becomes a back and forth, right? It becomes this incredible, like, much more complicated, technology war. It's not like the Cold War, we're all trying to build the better bomb. It's a much more complex measure and countermeasure sort of conflict between us and our potential adversaries. So on the issue of cyber, you can look at cyber from like big national defense government related views, but you can also think about cyber at home, right? And really thinking about, there's a lot of unprotected IoT systems that exist, whether you're the Pentagon or you're just a small SMB company that's trying to figure out how to manage against some of these attacks. And so one of the areas that we've been really, really bad at as a sort of cyber market is addressing middle and small business markets on how to protect their cyber assets. And so we've been thinking as a firm about how do we create startups that enable that sort of down market motion so you can actually have people afford to have the kind of protection that usually happens in enterprise cyber. And that comes to more available cyber insurance so you can do something if you know that you've been hacked, to SaaS platforms that are cheaper ways of getting the expertise that typically currently comes with large consulting groups or enterprise software platforms that exist for the S&P 500.
Yeah, I think that's all really. I think that's really great observations. And again, there's this ongoing, ceaseless, and it's never going to stop escalation upon escalation upon escalation. Certainly for the more traditional national security sense in terms of government and countermeasures and offensive and defensive, but also the enterprise, of course, and the cyber threats. The surface area continues to get more and more complex. For instance, in the enterprise, the secure access and secure edge as there's a proliferation of devices and more remote devices and workers. That surface area becomes more complex, so you have to defend against that. There's always the traditional, and that's not to minimize it. It continues to be a problem. All kinds of hacks and data exfiltration, right, which we see, and then of course connected devices as well. So to build upon that, I'd like David's perspective on that, as well as other areas such as critical infrastructure, and then also I'll shift topics after that to the disinformation area. But let's start there still.
Well, this is a topical question for me because I was newly arrived in LA from the East Coast, and during that month, I just changed my health insurance, I think, over to Anthem. So in the same month, my SF-86 was leaked through the OPM hack, and the Chinese got all my health information from Anthem. So this is the world that we live in. And I applaud you guys for putting together this panel with some emphasis on cybersecurity and also space, because, and I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but I think 25 years ago was Norm Augustine. It was talking about the Pentagon's success in investing in dual-use technologies, and he opined that this is an adventure that was unblemished by success at the time. But the way that the world has evolved, and the way, and you put the attack surface is evolving, and the way that national security has now brought in all of these private sector components, all of which are interconnected, has made failure not an option. And so while the defense acquisition process is very, very difficult to manage and to change, I think space and cyber are two areas where we've seen a lot of success stories. One of the most interesting transactions that we've been able to represent over the past couple of years is a group of engineers coming out of Lockheed Martin Valley Forge, and they were setting up technical systems in the operational technology space, and they had one customer, which is the largest energy producer in the Western US. We sold that business to Accenture, and now they're proliferating that technical solution across a global installed base. All of the engineers there had security clearances because the work that they did with the energy companies also was in collaboration with the NSA, and that's the future where we're going. In terms of middle market technology companies that are doing exciting things in both the private sector and in the defense space, again, the advent of the SaaS business model has enabled a lot of innovation here. And the most interesting businesses that we are fortunate enough to work with have identified a particular problem. A lot of this ends up being a problem of data management, big data analysis, because there's so much to process in terms of forensics, remediation. So there's a lot of analytical technologies, many powered by AI, that are very interesting in the space that we're looking at.
And I'll let Fen come back and comment on that. Obviously, one of the great applications of AI, what was originally machine learning, then AI, now generative AI, is, for instance, just even in terms of threat indicators, it's the needle in the haystack problem. Whether it's the enterprise or the government or whatever it is, you have this massive, unimaginable amount of data. And that data, even when you cull it down to things that are potential threats or abnormalities, it's still so massive that you simply cannot find a way to pick out the really important indicators. And of course, that leads to one element of this, which is we're 2 million cybersecurity professionals short by all estimates. But even with that said, technology here is critical. So that's my way of back to you, Founder, who is a data scientist, but also you were already commenting on this problem in terms of data and AI applications.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So the use of AI in cybersecurity has been around, like people have been talking about it for a long time. But for a very long time, it's like, does my security analyst need another Splunk dashboard that shows them some other view that's AI enabled, and then it's just another sort of, there's too many dashboards for everybody to check out in this sort of cyber world, right? And for a really long time, there's this proliferation of like, okay, here's like this another analysis that you can take a look at, and how do you actually use that information? I do think we're at a place where AI can start reducing sort of the information overload, right? With this new sort of level of transformers and LLMs, and trying to get a reduction on the human sort of productivity that is needed to go through all of this information. Even though the word AI, machine learning, has been used for so long within the cyber world, I do think in the future that you might be able to see some more automation, true automation within cybersecurity, which we quite honestly haven't actually had with all the promise from the last 10, 15 years. So I'm optimistic. However, the cyber world is surprisingly slow to move in some of these things, and as you think about, like, there have been a lot of entrenched large companies working in the world that have defined what the marketplace means. What does it take for a small company to come out there and try to displace Splunk? That's really hard, really, really hard, right? But I think that we're ripe at the time where fundamentally new technology in the data layer can enable you to do something very different, whether you're a security analyst, or maybe you don't need that security analyst anymore because it's been automated.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you're in the cybersecurity business at all, it's a poorly kept secret. CISOs are just saying, enough. I can't endure one more security vendor. I already have 19 different vendors doing 19 different things. And that's just another needle in the haystack problem. So I think that's a great observation. I'd like to shift to just one more topic on cyber before moving away from cyber briefly, which is also another obviously national security issue, is disinformation. We've seen this obviously in terms of social media. It's influenced politics. but it's also influenced other elements. And so, that is a very real national security challenge, apart from also being a vector for all kinds of cyber criminals, including some that are really formidable, even state-sponsored, and also provides a vector for ransomware. And we're talking about the kind of ransomware where, if you remember, for instance, what happened with Continental, where there's actual critical infrastructure that's held hostage. That's another vector. So, on the topic of disinformation, I'd like to turn it back to the panel briefly on this topic in terms of cutting edge and where we think that we're going there, because being able to discern and defend against disinformation is perhaps one of the greatest challenges that we have from a national security perspective in cyber. And so, there's companies like Moonshot, which are countering, kind of threat terrorist actors, but there's all kinds of other technologies that are in place. So I'd like Fen and David to comment briefly on what you see there at the cutting edge of investment and innovation addressing disinformation.
It's certainly been, it's a concern, right? You see policymakers, both parties in power, parties out of power, talking about this threat, trying to characterize it in, one way or another. Whether there's a technology solution that can resolve this is an interesting question. I feel it needs the introduction of an honest broker. If you can find an honest broker, I want to know where you find them. It's a difficult problem. I don't know that there's a technological answer to it, but Fen, if you've got one, please tell me.
I think it's it's called disinformation, but there's actually so many different subcomponent problems to it. So one of the companies we've invested in is a company called Loti, which is LA based and really focused on people misusing images of celebrities, people and to promote whatever they wanted to promote, disinformation, or even simply like this celebrity never paid for their image to be promoting a brand, right? And now their image is being used for free via AI to promote that brand, and being able to identify that. And also part of that is the takedown, right? Once you identify the disinformation, what are the processes, infrastructure in place to take down that information once it's been identified? And so that's sort of one particular niche of disinformation that actually is very, very toxic to LA, because in some ways it undermines some of the fundamental basis of this industry to be able to do that. The other way that I think about disinformation is more at this trusted broker, this idea of provenance. And despite everything that's happened from the crypto world and the blockchain world, we do have a technology now to create sort of a root of trust, common basis of information around something that can track provenance for us as a group. So that you have places where you can create now a system of record that is not managed by any single entity, but managed by a group through blockchain. And so whether it's, the deed to your house to, supply chain and trying to make sure that you actually have the information about your supply chain and where it comes from, we do have a technology platform that exists there for something I think far more exciting than cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. The last one is I'm going to go back to amazing technology, physics, right? So some of the things that I've seen is how do you combat disinformation by creating new modes of identifying provenance. One of the exciting areas that I've seen has been around hardware that basically can tag pieces of data with cryptographic information that says this was created by this piece of hardware. So creating some sort of, so you can have this in CCD cameras where you take that picture, that image has been tagged, and if you modify that image in any sort of way, you will actually affect the cryptographic layer underneath it, and therefore you know that it's been modified. And so there are solutions, deep tech solutions to some of these, but it's gonna take years to develop.
No, it's interesting. I was just reading a Security Week article yesterday that was citing a study that at a minimum, for every one physical human being identity, there's a minimum of 17 digital identities. That's on average. So it just gives you just a little bit of a sense in terms of the scope of the problem. As we're going into the last leg here of this session, I'd like to shift to the last topic, which is about private sector collaboration and public sector collaboration, both from a funding, programmatic, and investment perspective. Obviously, there's the whole government contracting world, but I'd like the panelists to speak to what's the current state of play, what's working, what remains to be done. There's some already inherent actors, for instance, Incatel, which is the venture capital capitalists for the intelligence community. They're not a USG entity, but there are kind of those crossover points. There's many others. But again, back to this panel, and this includes, again, all vectors of national security in terms of what's working well with public-private sector collaboration and joint funding for innovation, and what do you see still is the work that remains to be done. So I'd like to hear from all of you on the panel on that topic.
Yeah, sure, I can start. So are you talking more about in terms of investments or customers or combination?
Primarily investment and joint, collaborating to create solutions, finance solutions, and also operationalize solutions for this joint problem set.
Absolutely. So in our vertical, as it relates to space stations, the intent is for NASA to be our anchor tenant and our anchor source of funding longer term. The reality, though, is that NASA is not going to be comfortable unless we are able to prove out a very vibrant investment ecosystem from private corporations, but also from sovereign funds and other sovereign governments as well. And so I think to ultimately ensure success of our enterprise, we do need to have very coordinated collaboration. I do think that in our sector, having the support of NASA, which is, again, to use David's point, one of the largest customers on the planet with incredible credit quality, that will just ease the comfort of any private investors that want to take a bet on commercial space stations.
Fen, and you have experience with this, having worked in government, but on the nexus of this.
Right. So as a program officer at the National Science Foundation, we gave out a lot of grants, and so grants for basically, fundamental research. But when you think about commercialization, right, the government has a few different ways of doing that. The SBIR program has been around for a very, very long time, right? And it is a congressionally mandated, if you do any sort of research, you have to set aside, 3%, I think it was, of that money to support small businesses, right? So they're doing something interesting. And so the SBIR programs run very differently from all of the different agencies, and the DoD SBIR, really is a key way that they're doing sort of very, very early stage procurement almost, right? And so whereas, places like NSF will do the SBIR more as a way of saying, okay, we want to support some new startup that has a truly novel new technology. We may not know exactly the broader impact of it, but we want to support that. I do think that, I've been, so it's been in the better part of this decade on the private side, but I do think now we're seeing actually a much better set of programs coming out of the government to support contracting with smaller entities than there was 10 years ago. Take a look at the Defense Innovation Unit, right? That really was designed to make supporting, defense-related government contractors who are not the stereotypical Lockheed Martins or the Northrops of the world, and be able to actually and innovate defense in a fundamentally different way. So I do think the government has thought of new ways. Now, they have like $1 billion+ in DIU right now, which lots and lots of startups are really excited about. Could it be even bigger? I would like to propose that, instead of being trapped in the FAR, the federal, acquisition requirements, but trapped in that dynamic, that we actually open up more of these new, fundamentally different ways for startups to be able to interact with the government. And I'm optimistic that we'll get there.
Yeah, before I turn it over to David, just one comment. One of my biggest individual takeaways from this LA Tech Week is the number of national security tech companies that are now relying on the SBIR program because it's more agile. And so, the traditional behemoth sort of contracting, USG contracting bureaucracy, which still exists, there's at least some now renewed hope and advancement by the government. And the number of early stage NatSec tech companies here in LA that mentioned SBR this week, I couldn't count them. I mean, it was at least probably 24. So in any case, I'm going to let David, turn it over to David to wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good sign, right? Because you can't get farther away from the Beltway than in LA. And Fen and I were talking about this in the green room. The government will spend $6 billion on SBIR programs this year. And if we've represented 50 technology companies over the years, half of those have had SBIR programs. Many of them have graduated to phase 3, where the government is actually acquiring this technology. The other trend that we're watching is what you really want to see is flexible contract vehicles that source real innovation and not the same services from a company that's just small or has some sort of other disadvantaged designation. And so there's something called Other Transaction Authority that represents a flexible way of reaching out to the private sector, bringing innovation into the government. And so OTA funding this year will be $19 billion, and it was 14 just 2 years ago. A lot of this is involved in software development, technologies, also the success of the Pentagon in bringing in private sector technologies right now it's going to be the success of the national security community or the failure, right? So if you look at AI as an interesting example, the Department of Defense spent $2 billion in AI. Now that understates things by a bit, right? Because you've got AI and machine learning embedded into other larger R&D and procurement programs. But the private sector has spent $350 billion over the last 5 years. And so the technologies that are going to transform the way that we protect the country are already out there. They're being developed. And because they're readily available in the private sector and the commercial world, that's giving our peer competitors, think China, a way to catch up. And so this is the challenge, I think, for the Pentagon and the acquisition community in general. We are seeing some improvements, but it's not nearly enough. It's not fast enough, but I'm glad to hear things are happening here in LA.
Yeah. Well, again, we're running up against time, but as always, government is slow to evolve, but it is good to hear that the procurement and also the overall budgeting and investment is starting to at least become a little bit more agile. And again, this is also an integral part of LA. This is the capper to LA Tech Week, and of course, really in this ecosystem. LA and Southern California has leadership in multiple growth areas, but this is one of them. I mean, again, it's DC Metro and it's LA, and so that's very important to more locally to all of us here in the Southern California ecosystem. I'd like to thank all the...
one concluding thought that I had as I'm sitting up here. The topic of the panel is investing in defense technology. And I guess if I can leave you guys with one thought, it's if you're thinking about getting into this space, if you're looking at opportunities, invest in companies that are solving problems through government contracts rather than invest in a government contractor. And that is a big distinction. All of the most successful processes that we've run feature companies that are doing something wholly new, disruptive, and they look at the government contract as a vehicle to achieve that goal rather than, the cart before the horse.
I think that's a really great and important distinction to make. I'd like to thank this wonderful panel here. We're up on time. Hopefully this has been educational and valuable to everyone. Again, thank you so much to David, to Fen, and to Sid for being here. They're all deep experts in their own area. And we're going to bring up the next panel now.
Thank you very much.